Before we get started on baking, there are a few things we should do to prepare ourselves. To start with, you'll need two models. Typically, this is a high-resolution model and a low-polygon model. Your high-resolution model can be created in any way you like, really. It can be sculpted in a program like ZBrush, like I have here, or you could have hard surface modeled it traditionally in something like Maya or Max or whatever works best for you. Your high-resolution model can also consist of multiple meshes, so don't think that you have to get your bakes done in a single pass. In fact, it's almost inevitable that you have to break things up a little bit for easier baking, unless your model is really simple, like it's just a nude body, then maybe you could get away with just having one mesh for the high res and a single one for the low res. But we'll go over tackling complex bake situations a little bit later. On the model here, you can see that I actually have quite a few different subtools here, and in a lot of cases I keep it like this, so that I'll build depending on how you built your low polygon model, sometimes it's easier to keep it separate and bake these components separately and then combine it together later. It just really depends, and that kind of thing. Once you have more experience, you can kind of predict how things will bake, and you'll be able to make better decisions about what to keep together and what to separate. In this case, a lot of these pieces are separate because I actually had a lot of polygons to work with. But if your polygon limit was a lot more modest, then you might have to consolidate a lot of these things. For the low polygon model, the main requirement is that it needs to match the shapes of the high resolution model in order to avoid baking problems. There are a few situations where generalizing the shape of the low polygon model can actually yield better results in the bake, but generally speaking, having more polygons that conform closely to the high resolution model will make things easier for you. Every polygon face on your low polygon model also needs to have some sort of UV coordinate info. If you don't, then you'll probably get an error when baking. After all, the program needs to know what to do with the surfaces that it samples. However, one thing I want to clear up right away is that you only really need UV information on the low polygon model and not on the high polygon model. That's not to say that there aren't uses for having UVs on the high-res model, but they don't really come into play during the actual baking process. And I personally almost never bothered creating UVs for the high-res model because it just isn't necessary in most cases, unless you're using it as a way to help you do something specific, like getting more detail on your sculpt somehow. But for baking, it's just something that you don't have to worry about. Both the high and low res models should consist of polygons with 3 or 4 sides. So triangles, quads, but no n-gons, which is faces with more than 4 sides. Usually if you have that, it's prone to have baking errors, or you're just getting an error outright and it won't bake at all. And n-gons, honestly, they're kind of bad practice for game art anyway. Normally, when I go to bake, I will triangulate my model, or triangulate and then export it and use that for baking. And that's mostly just because I want the triangulation to stay consistent throughout the process, so that whatever the triangulation Maya uses, I'm sure that it's used in whatever program I'm using to bake. And I went over that in one of the previous videos. Something I should have mentioned back at the modeling stages is that ideally your meshes should be at the proper scale and orientation before it goes to baking. It's easy to forget about scale and orientation and then have it become a source of stress later on, so make sure to do your homework. Talk to your client or boss and try to get these things sorted out as soon as possible, because really nothing will make you feel more stupid than struggling with a bake only to find that the reason why it's not working is because your meshes aren't even in the same place, or something like that. I remember there was a time when we were having problems with ZBrush exporting at a different scale than what we'd bring the base meshes in, so that, you know, if we tried to bake at that point, then, you know, the high and the low res wouldn't match, and then especially if you're baking an X normal where you can't, where you don't really see what's happening, it can just cause a lot of frustration. And I've had to deal with models from other artists that were made, you know, entirely upside down and backwards because they were using a different coordinate system, and, you know, at completely different scales. And believe me, that's not fun. It's true that you could just rotate and rescale the final low polygon model, but the problem is that if you ever need to go back and make an edit, then it can be very difficult and unintuitive to deal with. Keeping all of your meshes at the proper scale will just make everyone's life easier, including your own. If you're working on a project where the characters are made to scale to each other, then you can also be more confident that the settings you use when baking for one character can be reasonably close for use on another character, you know, at least as a starting point. And even if I'm just making person art, I try to use some kind of real-world scale, such as centimeters, and that's what I have on this model here. You can see that my Hela character is 178 centimeters tall, or about 5'10", something like that. Using real-world scale makes it relatively easy to convert to other measurements if that becomes necessary, and this also helps the model work more predictably when moving between different programs. For example, some lighting and rendering calculations are based off of real-world measurements, so having a model that is too large or too small can really complicate things, such as lighting and shadowing calculations. It can also cause some problems with, you know, camera clipping planes, Z-fighting, all sorts of things like that. So it's best to get everyone on the same page and work from there. I know a lot of that sounds like common sense, but I come across all these problems quite often, and they can really be a pain to work around.